This discussion is not over.
27 million to a teacher? She'll burn it in a month. What about me? I'm family too.
Grandma and Grandpa made their choice.
Sign, now. 10% and you stay in this family.
Be reasonable, dear. You can buy a nicer apartment.
Covers mode platform.
You made a very big mistake. C.H. Lowy, I'm going home. They're home.
You brought outsiders into a family matter?
I'm here as a friend, unless a crime occurs. Here are the loan records you never repaid.
Hey.
5 years ago, they moved the assets into an irrevocable trust, with me as sole beneficiary.
I'm Chloe, 27 years old, and I'm a kindergarten teacher. After my grandparents died, I found myself in a sterile lawyer's office about to hear their final wishes. This was supposed to be a sad but peaceful farewell to the only two people who ever truly saw me. But as my father, mother, and brother sat beside me, the tension in the room was suffocating. Then, the lawyer read the final line of the will, and my world tilted on its axis. He said I alone was inheriting the entire $27 million estate. My father stood up so fast his chair screeched against the floor. He looked at me, his eyes filled not with grief, but with a cold, terrifying fury, and said, "This discussion is not over." The feeling of dread that washed over me was absolute. But I had no idea that later that night he would make me homeless. If you've ever felt completely alone in your own family, let me know where you're watching from. And be sure to hit like and subscribe, because you are not going to believe what happened next. While my parents' house was a showcase designed to impress, my grandparents' home was a sanctuary built to love. It was a modest 4-bedroom house, the kind you see in old movies about small-town America, nestled on 3 acres of land. That place, it was the only place I ever felt like I could breathe. My grandfather, Harold, wasn't a man of fancy words. He was a man of principles. He built a logistics empire from nothing, starting with a single truck and a dream in his garage. Yet, you'd never know it. He drove the same pickup for 20 years, and his favorite shirt had a patch on the elbow that my grandmother sewed herself. He used to tell me, "Chloe, money is a tool. It's not a measure of your worth. Use it to build something meaningful, not to impress people who don't matter." His words were the bedrock of my life. My grandmother, Elizabeth, was the heart of that home. While my own mother was busy networking at country clubs, my grandma was teaching me how to bake cookies from scratch and how to listen more than I talked. She kept a vegetable garden where Grandpa Harold taught me to grow tomatoes and zucchini. They lived simply, but their love felt like the most extravagant wealth in the world. They were the ones in the front row at every school play, the ones who cheered the loudest at my soccer games. When I told my family I wanted to become a kindergarten teacher, my father scoffed. He said my potential was being wasted on a job that barely paid minimum wage. My mother worried about how it would look to her friends, but my grandparents, they were thrilled. Genuinely. They saw purpose where my parents only saw a small paycheck. They understood. They always understood. That support system became my silent strength, my secret weapon. They were my true north. 6 weeks ago, that compass shattered. I was grading papers on a Tuesday night when I got the call. A drunk driver had run a red light. My grandparents died instantly. The officer on the phone said they didn't suffer, but that was small comfort. The funeral was a blur of empty gestures. My parents argued with the funeral director about costs. My brother Jason spent most of his time on his phone, probably trading crypto. My Aunt Pam cried for the cameras and stopped the moment they were put away. None of them had visited my grandparents in years, but suddenly, they were the stars of a tragedy they hadn't bothered to read the script for. I just felt numb. The two people who truly saw me, who valued me, were gone. 2 weeks later, a call came from Matthew Goldstein, my grandparents' attorney. He requested my immediate family's presence for the reading of the will. I drove to his office with a pit in my stomach, not because I expected anything, but because I knew it would be another performance. My family arrived in a fleet of luxury cars, my father checking his expensive watch impatiently before we were even inside. We all sat around a large oak table, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. My father sat at the head, as if claiming authority. "Let's get this over with," he announced. "Some of us have actual businesses to run." Matthew, a kind man in his 60s, who I knew was a close friend of my grandparents, simply nodded and began to read. He went through the legal jargon, and I could see my family shifting impatiently. Finally, he got to the important part. He cleared his throat and said, "We hereby bequeath our entire estate, including all cash assets, our investment portfolio, all real estate holdings, and our stake in Alexander Logistics, totaling approximately $27 million. He paused, and my father leaned forward, a smug look on his face. Then Matthew finished the sentence. "To our beloved granddaughter, Chloe Foster." Silence. A complete, deafening silence. I thought I had misheard him. I must have. $27 million? It was an impossible number. My modest, coupon-clipping grandparents had accumulated that much? Then, the second part of the bombshell dropped. Matthew continued, "We specifically and intentionally make no provisions for our son Richard, our daughter-in-law Diane, or our grandson Jason." The silence was shattered. "Let me see that!" my father shouted, snatching the document from Matthew's hands. His face turned a dark shade of red as he scanned the paper. My mother started screeching. $27 million to a kindergarten teacher? She wouldn't know the first thing about managing that kind of money. Jason slammed his fist on the table. "What about me? I'm family too. I need that for my business ventures." They all turned to me then, their eyes filled with a terrifying mix of disbelief and accusation. My Aunt Pam's face was twisted in rage. "What did you do?" she hissed. "How did you manipulate them into this?" I just sat there, frozen. My family had no idea about the life I had built with my grandparents, the relationship we shared that had nothing to do with money. They still saw me as the little girl with a hobby for a job, someone who just got by. They had no clue that the very values they dismissed were the exact reason my grandparents had entrusted me with everything. This inheritance wasn't just a sum of money. It was the ultimate validation. It was the secret weapon I never knew I had. And it had just been armed. Before my grandparents' lawyer, Matthew, could even finish explaining the video message they had left, my father grabbed my arm. His grip was surprisingly strong, his knuckles white. "This discussion," he hissed, his voice low and guttural, "is not over. Come to our house tonight, 6 o'clock. We will sort this out as a family." It wasn't a request. It was a summons. I was too stunned to argue, so I just nodded numbly. As I watched them drive away in their separate luxury vehicles, I sat in my 10-year-old sedan, clutching the thick envelope from Matthew, and wondered how a blessing could so quickly turn into a curse. I spent the afternoon in a daze, just driving aimlessly around town before stopping at a quiet park to try and gather my thoughts. The envelope sat on the passenger seat, unopened. Part of me was terrified of the responsibility it represented. Another part just wanted to pretend the last 3 hours never happened. At 5:45, I pulled into my parents' driveway. Their 5,000-square-foot house loomed over me, all sharp angles, granite, and glass. It was a house designed to impress, not to welcome. I took a deep breath, grabbed the envelope, and headed inside. They were waiting for me in the formal living room, a space rarely used except for my mother's social gatherings. My father stood by the fireplace, a tumbler of scotch already in his hand. My mother was perched on the edge of a designer chair that looked incredibly uncomfortable. Jason was sprawled across a white leather sofa, scrolling through his phone, while my Aunt Pam paced back and forth, muttering to herself. My Uncle Steve just stood by the window, gazing out as if wishing he were anywhere else. "Sit down, Chloe," my father commanded without any greeting. I chose a chair near the door. A small part of my brain, the part that wasn't numb with shock and grief, recognized that I might need a quick exit. "Let's be reasonable about this," he began, his voice switching into that smooth, practiced tone he used for business negotiations. "Your grandparents, they clearly weren't thinking straight. They meant for the family to benefit, not just you." My mother nodded enthusiastically. "Sweetheart, managing wealth is complicated. It's a huge burden. Your father has the experience to handle this properly. You can still have a nice portion, of course. Perhaps enough for a down payment on a real house instead of that little apartment." The condescension in her voice was like a physical slap, but I remained silent. I just couldn't find the words. My lack of response seemed to embolden my father. "Here's what we propose," he said, setting his glass down. "You sign over the estate to me. As the financial head of this family, I will ensure everyone gets their fair share. You will receive 10%, which is more than generous considering your limited needs." 10%. I finally found my voice, even if it was just a whisper. That would still be over $2 million. "Exactly," Jason jumped in, finally looking up from his phone. "More than enough for a teacher. I need at least 5 million for my new crypto exchange platform. It's going to be huge." I looked at him, at his smug, entitled face, and thought about his last huge venture, an app for rating public restrooms that had burned through $50,000 of my parents' money in 3 months. "The house should go to us," Aunt Pam interjected, her voice sharp. "We have 3 children to consider. That neighborhood would give them access to better schools." I almost laughed. It was an ugly, bitter sound that caught in my throat. She had never once visited my grandparents in that house. Not once. As the evening wore on, their tactics shifted. When demands didn't work, they turned to guilt. "After all we've done for you," my mother said, her eyes welling up with crocodile tears. "We gave you life, a good home, opportunities. Is this how you repay family loyalty?" Loyalty. I nearly choked on my water. When was the last time either of them had called just to check on me? My father changed strategies again, his voice becoming hard as steel. "We're not asking, Chloe. We are telling you what will happen. Either you sign the transfer documents voluntarily, or we will contest the will. We will drag your name through the mud. We'll bring up every questionable interaction you ever had with your grandparents. How often did you visit them alone? What did you tell them about us when we weren't there? It will get ugly." The threat hung in the air, thick and poisonous. I felt sick, but somewhere deep inside me, a core of anger was beginning to harden. At 10:30, my father printed out a crudely drafted transfer document and slid it across the coffee table to me, along with a pen. "Sign it," he demanded. "Now." I picked up the paper. It was a complete surrender, signing away all my rights in exchange for a percentage to be determined later, at his sole discretion. I put the paper down, took a deep breath, and looked him in the eye. "No." The room went dead silent. "What did you just say?" he asked, his voice dangerously low. "I said no," I repeated, my own voice stronger now. "I will not sign this. My grandparents trusted me for a reason, and I intend to honor that trust." The room exploded. My mother shrieked about my ingratitude. Jason called me a selfish bitch. Aunt Pam started sobbing about her children's future being ruined. Through it all, I just sat there, the word no echoing in my mind. Finally, my father slammed his glass down so hard it cracked. "That's enough," he roared, his face purple with rage. He stalked towards me, pointing his finger inches from my face. "You have a choice to make right now, Chloe. Either you sign that paper and remain part of this family, or you take your precious inheritance and consider yourself disowned. You can't have both. I looked at their faces, twisted with greed and anger. There was no love there, no understanding, just hunger. I'm not signing, I said, standing up. Then get out of my house, he snarled. I live in my own apartment, I reminded him. He laughed, a cold, cruel sound that chilled me to the bone. The apartment we co-signed for? We own that building through one of our investment companies, Chloe. Consider your lease terminated. My world stopped. You have 30 minutes to pack your essential items, my mother said, checking her watch as if timing a race. The locks will be changed tomorrow. I was on autopilot, moving through a nightmare. I went to my old bedroom, the one I stayed in on holidays, and started throwing clothes into a duffel bag. My father stood in the doorway watching me, his arms crossed. You were never really part of this family anyway, he said, his voice completely flat. Your mother and I were going to divorce before she got pregnant with you. You were the obligation that kept us together. The words hit me like a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. An obligation. Not a daughter. An obligation. As I moved to grab a small stack of photo albums from my bookshelf, the ones filled with pictures of me and my grandparents, laughing, baking, gardening, my father stepped forward, blocking my path. Leave those, he commanded. What? No, I stammered, clutching one to my chest. It was a picture of me, age 8, sitting on my grandpa's shoulders. These are mine. These are my memories. He snatched the album from my hands, his lip curling into a sneer. No, these are evidence, he said, the word dripping with venom. Evidence for our lawsuit against you. They perfectly document how you systematically wormed your way into their lives, poisoning them against their real family. Our lawyer will love these. And that was it. That was the moment something inside me broke. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was never just about the money. They were trying to steal my past. They were trying to take the only pure, unconditional love I had ever known and twist it into something ugly and manipulative. They weren't just disowning me. They were trying to erase me, to rewrite my entire history into a narrative that suited their greed. This act, this seizing of my personal history, my proof of love, created a burning need inside me to find a greater truth they couldn't touch. A truth I prayed was waiting for me at my grandparents' house. You won't get away with this, I whispered, my voice shaking with a fury I didn't know I was capable of. I already have, he replied, turning his back. Time's up. Get out. And just like that, after everything, I was thrown away. At this point, I honestly don't have a word for what I was feeling. If you're feeling the same way I am right now, help me out. Comment one word to describe my family's actions, but instead of breaking me, that rage, it turned into a cold, hard resolve. They had made a very, very big mistake. I walked out of that house and into the cool night air, the door slamming behind me with a disturbing finality. For a moment, I just stood there on the perfectly manicured lawn, the weight of my 3 duffel bags digging into my shoulders. I was homeless. My family had disowned me, and they had stolen my memories. In the span of a few hours, I had gained a $27 million fortune and lost everything else that had ever defined my world. I finally made it to my car, dumped my bags in the back, and sat in the driver's seat. And then, I let myself break. The tears I had been holding back finally came, not as a gentle stream, but as a violent, racking flood. Great heaving sobs shook my entire body. I cried for my grandparents, whose absence felt more acute and painful than ever. I cried for the family I had always desperately wanted but never truly had. And mostly, I cried for myself. a 27-year-old woman suddenly adrift in a world that had completely turned upside down. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few minutes, the storm of tears subsided, leaving behind a hollow emptiness. I wiped my eyes, started the car, and just drove. I had nowhere to go. Friends were an option, but how could I even begin to explain this insane situation at nearly midnight? Then I remembered the thick envelope Matthew had given me. I pulled over, my hands shaking as I tore it open. Inside, amongst a sheaf of legal documents, was a set of keys. They were attached to a familiar rabbit-shaped keychain my grandmother had cherished. The keys to my grandparents' house. The house that was now, unbelievably, mine. The drive took 20 minutes, but each mile felt like a pull between two opposing forces. I was drawn to the comfort and safety of their home, but I was terrified of facing the profound emptiness inside without them. The porch light was on, probably on a timer my grandfather had set. I sat in the driveway for a long time, just staring at the front door, gathering the courage to cross the threshold. Finally, I grabbed one bag and walked up the steps, the key trembling in my hand. The moment I opened the door, the smell hit me. It was the scent of my entire childhood. A mixture of my grandmother's lemon verbena potpourri and the wood polish my grandfather used on the furniture every Sunday. I flipped on the lights, half expecting to hear their voices calling a greeting from the kitchen. But the silence that answered was deafening. It was heavier, more profound than just an absence of sound. It was the sound of loss. I made my way to the guest room, the one I had always used, and dropped my bag on the bed. Everything was exactly as I had left it after my last weekend visit, just a month before the accident. The novel I had been reading was still on the nightstand, a bookmark holding my place. Fresh towels were folded neatly on the dresser, placed there by my grandmother in anticipation of the next visit that would never happen. That small act of love, of thoughtfulness, undid me all over again. I sank onto the bed and cried until exhaustion finally claimed me, falling asleep fully clothed on top of the covers. Morning came with a disorienting brightness. For a split second, I forgot where I was. I expected to smell coffee brewing and hear my grandfather's off-key whistling from downstairs. Then reality crashed back in, cold and unforgiving. They were gone. And somehow, in their place, I had inherited not only their fortune, but also their enemies, all in the form of my own family. I looked at my phone. It had blown up overnight. A barrage of texts and missed calls, mostly from my father and mother. They were a bizarre mix of threats and sudden, transparent attempts at reconciliation. One message from my mother read, "We can work this out if you'll just be reasonable." My father was less subtle. "You have 24 hours to reconsider before we file suit." But it was Jason's text that sent a chill down my spine. It was just one sentence. "Enjoying the big, empty house?" Not for long. It wasn't just bluster. It sounded like a threat. My fingers trembled as I forwarded it to Matthew. His response was immediate. "Stay where you are. I'll be there in 30 minutes. Don't open the door for anyone else." His urgency was alarming, but it also provided a strange sort of comfort. At least, someone was on my side. Matthew arrived exactly 30 minutes later, carrying a briefcase and 2 coffees. I led him into the kitchen, and we sat at the small breakfast nook where my grandparents had shared thousands of meals. "First things first," he said, sliding a coffee toward me. "Your family has already contacted 3 different law firms about contesting the will. I anticipated this and have prepared countermeasures." I wrapped my hands around the warm cup, the heat a small comfort against the cold dread in my stomach. "They kicked me out last night," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "My father apparently owns my apartment building." Matthew nodded, his expression grim. "Typical Richard tactics, using leverage to force compliance. But what he didn't tell you, and likely doesn't know, is that your grandparents provided for this exact scenario. He began pulling documents from his briefcase. Your grandmother bought this small cottage 20 minutes outside of town 5 years ago. She kept it in a separate, private trust for you. Your father has no idea it exists. You have somewhere safe to go. Relief washed over me, so potent it almost made me dizzy. At least I wouldn't be homeless. But the idea of hiding out while my family circled like vultures didn't sit right with me. As if on cue, a soft knock sounded at the back door. Matthew smiled. That would be Carlos. Carlos Ramirez. The name was vaguely familiar. Matthew explained. He's been your grandparents' estate manager and handyman for 15 years. He lives in the guest house out back. I opened the door to a man in his early 50s with salt and pepper hair and kind, steady eyes. He held his hat in his hands respectfully. Miss Chloe, he said, his voice warm. I am very sorry about your grandparents. They were wonderful people. I saw your car this morning and wanted to check if you needed anything. His simple kindness nearly brought me to tears again. Thank you, Carlos. I am a bit overwhelmed. Carlos nodded. Mr. Harold and Mrs. Elizabeth worried about that. They asked me to look after you if anything happened to them. The house, the grounds, everything is maintained. I've been keeping watch. Matthew invited Carlos to join us. And over the next hour, Carlos shared stories that painted a picture of two people who were respected and beloved by everyone who worked for them. Then, he dropped a bombshell. Your father and brother, Carlos said carefully. They came here after the funeral, when no one was around. They took things. Watches, jewelry, some electronics. My stomach clenched. I have it all on the security cameras, he continued. They didn't know Mr. Harold had me update the system last year. He didn't trust the old one your father put in. Matthew made a note. That footage will be useful. There's more, Carlos said. Mrs. Elizabeth kept detailed journals. They're in her study. I followed him to my grandmother's small, sunlit study. On a built-in bookcase were dozens of leather-bound journals, each meticulously dated. Carlos pulled one from the shelf. This one mentions the last time your father asked for money, he said. I opened it, my grandmother's elegant handwriting filling the page. The entry documented my father's pitch for a crypto investment, his anger when refused, and his cruel accusation that I was only visiting to secure my inheritance. She had written, he couldn't be more wrong. Chloe has never asked for a penny. She brings us food and stays for conversation. Richard left without finishing his coffee. I read entry after entry, a documented history of years of greed and manipulation. As I was reading, the doorbell rang. It was Dorothy, my grandparents' housekeeper for 20 years. She hugged me tightly. You look just like Elizabeth when she was young, she said, her eyes misty. Over the next few hours, more people arrived. Rosa Martinez, my grandparents' sharp-as-a-tack business partner, is ready to guide me through the company's financials. George Patel, their investment advisor, with portfolios showing just how meticulously my inheritance was structured. Each person brought not just information, but a wave of genuine affection and loyalty. They were the real family my grandparents had built. While going through my grandmother's desk, Dorothy found a hidden compartment containing letters from my father, each one a request for money. Then she handed me a USB drive. Security footage from after the funeral, she said sadly. Your mother was going through Elizabeth's jewelry box before the reception even ended. My grandparents had been building a fortress around me, brick by brick, for years. They knew this day would come. Just as I was beginning to feel a sense of safety, of being surrounded by this incredible wall of support, the doorbell rang again. This time, it was a single, professional chime. Carlos answered it to find a man in a cheap suit holding a legal folio. Delivery for Ms. Chloe Foster, the man said flatly. Matthew took the documents. His face, which had been calm and reassuring all morning, darkened into a thundercloud as he read. "What is it?" I asked, my heart beginning to pound against my ribs. He laid the paper on the dining table for me to see. It was covered in dense, impenetrable legal text. "It's a lis pendens," he said, his voice tight with anger, "and an emergency motion to freeze the assets of the estate." I didn't understand the jargon, but Rosa Martinez, my grandparents' business partner, let out a sharp breath. "That was fast," she muttered. "He's not just contesting the will," Matthew explained, his eyes locking with mine, making sure I understood the gravity of the situation. "He's already taken action. A lease pendens is a public notice that this property is under dispute in a lawsuit. It effectively freezes it. He's trying to prevent you from selling it, mortgaging it, or using any of the estate's major assets. He is trying to cut you off at the knees and bleed you dry with legal fees before the real fight even begins." The audacity of it, the sheer calculated cruelty, was breathtaking. It was a raw power play. While I was grieving, while I was being thrown out onto the street, my father was already in his lawyer's office, weaponizing the legal system to paralyze me. This wasn't a threat anymore. This was the first shot of the war. A wave of hot, righteous anger surged through me, burning away the last of my grief and fear. This act of legal aggression, this attempt to render me powerless with my own inheritance, was the ultimate proof that they would stop at nothing. It solidified a thought in my mind, turning it from a possibility into a certainty. The confrontation tomorrow couldn't just be a defense. It had to be a decisive, overwhelming, and final counterattack. At that exact moment, as if summoned by my rage, my phone pinged. It was a text from Jason. "Hope you're enjoying Grandma and Grandpa's house while you can. Dad, Mom, Aunt Pam, Uncle Steve and I are coming over tomorrow morning at 10 Quao to collect what rightfully belongs to us. Better not try to stop us, or things will get ugly." I showed the message to Matthew. His expression turned to granite. "Threats, breaking, and now this frivolous legal action," he muttered. "That's it. It's time to activate the final part of your grandparents' plan." He made several quick phone calls, his voice low and urgent. When he finished, he turned to me, a look of grim determination in his eyes. "Your grandparents anticipated this exact scenario, Chloe. They knew Richard would not go quietly. They prepared for it. Tomorrow morning, we will be ready for them." He gestured to the pile of journals, the financial documents, the USB drives, and now, my father's own legal filings. "Your grandparents built more than just wealth," Matthew said. "They built a case. And tomorrow, we're going to present it." I spent the rest of the night not sleeping, but preparing, surrounded by my grandparents' life's work, their journals, their financial records, their carefully documented history of my family's greed. I felt a strange calm settle over me. The grief was still there, a heavy weight in my chest, but it was now overlaid with a cold, clear sense of purpose. I was not just a grieving granddaughter. I was the steward of their legacy, and I would not let them down. By 8 a.m., the house had become a command center. Matthew arrived with pastries and a thick folder of legal documents. "These are restraining orders, ready to be filed if necessary," he explained, his voice all business. "And these are cease and desist letters addressing the specific threats Jason made." Dorothy came next, immediately taking over the kitchen, the familiar smell of bacon and coffee filling the house, a comforting scent of normalcy before the coming storm. By 9:30, our team was assembled. Carlos positioned himself by the front door, a silent, immovable guardian. Rosa Martinez, my grandparents' business partner, had her laptop open at the dining table, ready to project financial evidence onto the large TV screen on the wall if needed. Dorothy bustled around, ensuring everyone had food and coffee, her simple presence a powerful connection to my grandparents' hospitality. At 9:45, a convoy of expensive cars began pulling into the long driveway. My father's black luxury sedan, my mother's pristine white SUV, followed by Aunt Pam and Uncle Steve's midlife crisis red convertible, and finally, Jason's impractical sports car that he could only afford because my parents paid his rent. They were early. A classic power move, trying to catch us off guard. The doorbell rang, not once, but 3 times in quick succession, followed by an aggressive pounding. Matthew nodded to Carlos, who opened the door. My father stood on the threshold, his face a mask of arrogant determination. He was momentarily surprised to see Carlos, not me, answering the door. Behind him, the rest of my family clustered together, their expressions ranging from smug to angry. "Where is she?" my father demanded, trying to push past Carlos. "This is family business." Carlos didn't move an inch. "Miss Chloe is expecting you," he said, his voice calm and steady. "Please come in." They filed into the foyer, their confident stride faltering as they saw the gathering in the living room. They stopped short, their eyes scanning the room. I stood in the center near the fireplace, with Matthew slightly behind me to my right. "What is this?" my mother asked, her voice brittle and sharp. "You brought outsiders into a private family matter?" Before I could answer, the front door opened again. This time, 3 more people entered, and the atmosphere in the room shifted dramatically. The first was Judge Robert Henderson, a tall, dignified man in his 70s, who had been one of my grandfather's oldest friends. He was followed by Police Chief Maria Williams, a woman whose own daughter's education had been quietly supported by my grandparents' charitable foundation. Last came Thomas Jang, my grandparents' financial advisor for over 20 years. My father's face went pale at the sight of Judge Henderson. The judge had ruled against him in a nasty business dispute years earlier, a case my father had tried and failed to influence through social connections. "Robert," my father said, attempting a jovial tone that fell completely flat. "What brings you here?" The judge's expression remained stern. "I am here at the request of Harold and Elizabeth Alexander, through their attorney, Matthew Goldstein. They asked that in the event of their deaths, I serve as an impartial witness to any family disputes regarding their estate." My mother turned to Chief Williams, her voice laced with indignation. "This is ridiculous. We are here to collect family heirlooms that rightfully belong to us. Why is law enforcement present?" The chief smiled, a thin, humorless expression. "I'm here as a friend of the Alexander family, not in an official capacity. Unless, of course," she added, her eyes sweeping over them, "someone commits a crime, in which case, my official duties would naturally take precedence." The implied threat hung in the air, thick and heavy. "You've got to be kidding me," Jason muttered from the back. "Is this supposed to intimidate us?" I finally stepped forward, feeling a strength that wasn't just my own. It was the collective strength of everyone in the room, the strength of my grandparents' legacy. "I know why you're here," I said, my voice clear and steady. "You believe you are entitled to my grandparents' estate, despite their explicit wishes. You think you can bully me or threaten me into giving you what you want?" My father's face hardened. "Those old fools were manipulated. We are simply here to correct that injustice." From behind me, Thomas Yang, the financial advisor, spoke up. His voice was quiet but carried the weight of authority. "Actually, Richard, I have documentation of every attempt you made to access your parents' assets over the last 20 years. He opened a folder. "This includes the unauthorized transfer attempt from their retirement account in 2016, the forged check incident in 2018, and your attempt to have Elizabeth declared incompetent last year after she refused to fund Jason's latest venture." My father's face reddened. That that is taken out of context. Rosa Martinez stepped forward next, a tablet in her hand. I also have records of the company loan you never repaid, Richard. $200,000, borrowed in 2012 for your vacation home in Aspen. Your parents never pursued repayment, though they certainly could have. One by one, my grandparents' friends and associates presented a calm, factual, and devastating account of my family's attempts to extract money over the years. They contrasted it with their minimal involvement in my grandparents' actual lives. Aunt Pam, who had been quietly fuming, finally exploded. She turned on me, her face blotchy with rage. You ungrateful little snake, you turned our parents against us, poisoned them with lies. Judge Henderson cleared his throat, a sound that cut through her screeching. Actually, Mrs. Davis, I have reviewed the video journals Elizabeth kept. There was no external influence. Your parents were quite clear about their reasoning. This is all very theatrical, my mother said dismissively, trying to regain control. But it changes nothing. We will contest the will. We will win. And that was my cue. I let them have their say. I let them posture and threaten. I watched as the net my grandparents had so carefully woven drew tighter around them. And then I spoke. You're right about one thing, I said, and all eyes turned to me. This isn't a negotiation. First, I looked at my mother and Aunt Pam. I know about the jewelry you took from this house right after the funeral, before the reception had even ended. Carlos has it all on video. My mother gasped, her hand flying to her pearl necklace, a necklace I now realized probably belonged to my grandmother. Next, I turned to my father. You want to talk about being manipulated? Let's talk about the 20 years of letters you sent, asking for money, threatening to keep me from them if they didn't pay up. Grandma kept every single one. Matthew stepped forward then, holding a thick envelope for each of them. This is for you, he said, his voice formal. It includes copies of banking records, text messages, emails, and the video evidence of your interactions with Harold and Elizabeth over the past decade. I encourage you to review it with your attorneys before you make any decisions about legal action. It will all become public record if you proceed. Uncle Steve, who had remained silent, opened his envelope. His face grew increasingly pale as he read. After a moment, he touched Aunt Pam's arm. We should go, he said quietly. This is not a fight we can win. She angrily shrugged him off. My father, however, had gone very still after scanning the contents of his envelope. There were records of business dealings he had clearly hoped would remain private, alongside transcripts of cruel comments he had made about his parents when he thought no one was listening. And then I delivered the final blow, the one they never saw coming. And by the way, Dad, I said, my voice calm, almost conversational, that lawsuit you filed yesterday? The Ellis pendants to freeze the estate? You can go ahead and withdraw it. It's going to be dismissed tomorrow anyway. A flicker of confusion crossed his face. He thought he had me trapped. He thought he was in control. What are you talking about? 5 years ago, I said, letting each word land with deliberate weight. After you tried to have Grandma declared incompetent, she and Grandpa made a change. They transferred this house, and the majority of their liquid assets, into an irrevocable trust. I paused, letting the legal term sink in. A trust. With me as the sole beneficiary and trustee upon their deaths. It's ironclad. Legally untouchable. The will was just a formality. You have absolutely no legal standing to contest it. You have nothing. It's over. The silence in the room was absolute. It was the sound of my father's entire world collapsing. The sound of his arrogance and greed turning to ash in his mouth. He had come here for a coronation, to claim his throne. Instead, he found himself checkmated in a game he never even knew he was playing. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I just stood there, in the house my grandparents built, surrounded by the family they had chosen, and let them face the truth. The word hung in the air. Irrevocable. For a moment, no one moved. It was as if I had pressed a pause button on reality, and my family was frozen in a tableau of disbelief. My father's face, which had been a mask of rage, was now slack with shock. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving behind a pasty, grayish pallor. He looked old and small. My mother was the first to break the silence. She let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob. An irrevocable trust? What is she talking about, Richard? She asked, her voice shrill with rising panic. She looked at my father, her eyes wide with a dawning horror, searching for a denial, an explanation, anything to make it not true. But he couldn't offer one. He just stared at me, his mouth slightly agape. Jason looked down at the thick folder in his hands, then back up at me, a look of genuine confusion on his face. "Is this a joke?" he asked, his voice cracking. "This has to be some kind of bluff, right?" He was looking for reassurance, for someone to tell him the game wasn't over, that this was just another negotiation tactic. But the faces of the people surrounding me, Matthew, Judge Henderson, Thomas Yang, were grim and unmoving. There was no bluff here, only cold, hard, legal fact. The moment the truth finally settled in, the panic began. It was like watching a dam break. The carefully constructed facade of family unity and control crumbled in an instant, washed away by a tidal wave of pure, unadulterated fear. They realized the game was over. They had lost. And the consequences were just beginning to dawn on them. My father understood the implications first. He wasn't just losing out on $27 million. The evidence in that folder, the forged check, the unauthorized transfer attempt, the business loan he never repaid. It wasn't just embarrassing. It was potentially criminal. He was a man obsessed with his reputation, with his image of success and power. And in that room, he was facing the total annihilation of both. Aunt Pam, who had been angrily leafing through her own folder, suddenly shrieked at my father. "You told me this was a sure thing, Richard. You told me she would fold. What is all this? What did you do?" Uncle Steve grabbed her arm, his face pale. "Pam, stop. Let's just go." "Go?" she screeched, pulling her arm away. "We can't just go. He's ruined us." The accusations started flying, a chaotic explosion of blame and recrimination. My father turned on Jason. "This is your fault," he roared, his voice trembling with fury. "If you hadn't been so greedy with your stupid failed business ideas, they never would have been so cautious. You pushed them too far." "Me?" Jason shot back, his voice rising to a yell. "You're the one who tried to get Grandma declared incompetent. You think they didn't know about that?" It was ugly. It was raw. It was the sound of a family devouring itself from the inside out. Now that there was no external prize to unite them, their greed, once a common goal, had become the weapon they now turned on each other. With their united front against me shattered, they did the only thing they had left to do. They turned their attention back to me. But this time, it wasn't with threats. It was with a desperate, pathetic attempt at manipulation. My mother was the first to try. Her face crumpled and real tears of self-pity and fear streamed down her cheeks. She took a step towards me, her hands outstretched. "Chloe, sweetheart," she pleaded, her voice thick with emotion. "Look what you've done. You've torn this family apart. All this ugliness. It's because of you." She was trying to make me the villain, to shift the crushing weight of their actions onto my shoulders. She wanted me to feel guilty, to feel responsible for the implosion that they themselves had caused. The woman who had told me I was an obligation, who had stood by as her husband made me homeless, was now asking me to fix the family she had helped break. It was so transparent, so manipulative, it was almost insulting. Before I could even respond, Jason stepped forward, his eyes wide and pleading. "Chloe, come on," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "How can you do this to us? To your own family? Mom and Dad. They did everything for us. Everything for you, I thought. They did everything for you." The hypocrisy was so staggering that it left me speechless. He was trying to appeal to a sense of family loyalty that he had never once displayed, a bond he had been willing to sever for a piece of a fortune he hadn't earned. He was asking for mercy from the sister he had mocked just hours before, as she was being kicked out onto the street. My father, seeing that the emotional appeals were failing, tried one last desperate gambit: bargaining. He straightened his tie, trying to recapture a shred of his former authority, but his voice was strained, his confidence gone. "All right, Chloe," he said, forcing a calmer tone. "Clearly, we've all said things we don't mean. We're emotional. Your grandparents are gone. Let's all just take a step back. We can work this out. There's no need for all this hostility. The trust? We can find a way to manage it together. As a family. We can renegotiate." Renegotiate. He still didn't get it. He still thought this was about a deal. About finding the right angle. The right leverage. He couldn't comprehend that he was standing in a room where money was no longer the currency of power. The currency in this room was truth, loyalty, and character. Concepts he had long since abandoned. I just looked at them. My mother, sobbing with self-pity. My brother, pleading with fake sincerity. My father, desperately trying to salvage a deal from the wreckage of his own making. And I felt nothing. The anger had burned away. The pain was still there, but it was a dull ache now, not a sharp wound. All I felt was a profound, empty sadness. A sadness for the family I should have had, for the people they should have been. Judge Henderson, sensing the confrontation was over, cleared his throat. "I believe," he said, his voice filling the suddenly silent room, "that this meeting has concluded. Richard, I would advise you to speak with your attorney before you say anything else." The finality in his tone was unmistakable. It was over. One by one, they seemed to deflate. The fight was gone, replaced by a dawning, terrifying acceptance of their new reality. Uncle Steve took a stunned and silent Aunt Pam by the arm and led her toward the door. Jason just stood there for a moment, looking lost, before he turned and shuffled out without another word. My mother gave me one last look, a mixture of hatred and pleading, before she turned and followed them. My father was the last to leave. He paused at the doorway and looked back at me. There was no anger left in his eyes. Just a hollow, defeated emptiness. "You've destroyed this family, Chloe," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. But there was no conviction in his words. He was just reciting a line from a script he no longer believed. And then, he was gone. The door closed, and the room was filled with a profound silence. The storm had passed. The house was quiet again. But it wasn't the heavy, grief-filled silence of the night before. This was a different kind of quiet. It was the silence of closure. The silence of a battle won. And the silence that comes just before you start to build something new. As the sound of my father's car faded down the long driveway, a profound silence settled over the house. The tension that had been coiling in my muscles for the past 48 hours finally began to release. I looked around the room, at the faces of the people who had stood with me, who had formed a protective wall around me without a moment's hesitation. And in that moment, I felt a strange mix of emotions. I was exhausted, yes. And there was a hollow ache where my family used to be. But underneath it all, there was something else. A feeling I hadn't realized I was missing my entire life. The feeling of being truly supported. Dorothy, my grandparents' longtime housekeeper, seemed to sense the shift in the atmosphere. She quietly went into the kitchen and returned a few minutes later with a tray of her famous homemade scones and a fresh pot of coffee. It was a simple gesture, but it felt monumental. It was an act of care, of normalcy, of cleansing the space of the toxic energy that had just vacated it. Carlos, who had been a silent, steady presence by the door, gave me a small, respectful nod. "They will not be back today, Miss Chloe," he said, and the certainty in his voice was more reassuring than any lock on any door. Rosa Martinez, my grandparents' business partner, was already back at the dining table, her laptop open. She looked up at me, not with pity, but with a sharp, professional respect. "All right," she said, her voice crisp. "Phase 1 is complete. Now we move to Phase 2, securing the assets and ensuring a smooth transition at the company. Your grandparents had a clear plan, and we are going to execute it." Judge Henderson placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. His touch was fatherly, in a way my own father's had never been. "Your grandparents would be proud, Chloe," he said, his voice rumbling with quiet authority. "Not just of what you did today, but of how you did it, with dignity and principle. These people, they weren't related to me by blood, but in that moment they felt more like family than my own parents ever had. They weren't there because they wanted something from me. They were there because of love and loyalty to my grandparents, and by extension, to me. They were the family I was meant to have, the family I had chosen by choosing to honor my grandparents' wishes. The onslaught, however, didn't end when they walked out the door. Within an hour, my phone started buzzing, and it didn't stop. A flood of text messages, one after another. First, from my mother, a long, rambling paragraph filled with guilt-tripping and accusations. "How could you be so cruel? I am your mother. After all I've sacrificed for you, this is how you repay me? You have destroyed us." Then came Jason. "Seriously, Chloe? You couldn't just share? You always had to have everything for yourself. Some sister you are." And then my father. His messages were short, clipped, and menacing. "This isn't over. You've made a powerful enemy today. You will regret this." For years, messages like these would have sent me into a spiral of anxiety and self-doubt. I would have agonized over them, trying to figure out what I could say or do to fix things, to make them happy. But something had fundamentally shifted inside me. I looked down at the screen, at their desperate, manipulative words, and I didn't feel guilt. I felt clarity. I took a deep breath. And then, I did something I had never dared to do before. I opened my contacts, found my mother's name, and pressed block. Then I did the same for my father, and for Jason, and for my aunt. One by one, I digitally severed the ties that had been choking me my entire life. It was a simple action, just a few taps on a screen, but it felt like I was breaking free from a cage. For the first time in my life, I was putting my own peace of mind first. I was choosing myself. This was a huge moment. For the first time, I wasn't backing down. I was choosing myself over their toxic demands. This was a turning point. If you support this powerful decision, drop a flexed bicep emoji in the comments to send some strength her way on this journey. That small act of defiance, that digital boundary, was the first step. The next one was making it legally official. I turned to Matthew. "I don't want to talk to them," I said, my voice steady. "I don't want their calls, their texts, or their emails. I am done." Matthew nodded, a look of profound understanding on his face. "I'll draft a formal communication," he said. "It will state that all future contact must be directed through my office. We'll also include a list of the items taken from the house, with a deadline for their immediate return, and a formal demand to withdraw the frivolous lawsuit." "And Matthew," I added, looking him straight in the eye, "make it clear, I am no longer responsible for their problems, their financial issues, Their emotional turmoil, none of it is my burden to carry anymore. That was it. My Declaration of Independence. It was terrifying, but it was also the most liberating moment of my life. I was finally free. As Matthew began drafting the letters, and Rosa began walking me through the first steps of understanding my new responsibilities with the company, I felt the true weight of my grandparents' gift. It wasn't just the money. The money was a tool, just like they always said. The real inheritance was this circle of people. This community is bound not by DNA, but by shared values of integrity, loyalty, and genuine affection. It was a family built on respect, not obligation. Over the next few days, that chosen family became my lifeline. Dorothy would show up with homemade casseroles, refusing to let me eat alone. Carlos would quietly fix a leaky faucet or check the security perimeter, his steady presence a silent promise of safety. Rosa became my mentor, patiently explaining the complexities of the business my grandparents had built, treating me not as a novice, but as their successor. And Matthew was my rock, navigating the legal minefield my family had created with calm, strategic precision. They didn't try to fix me or tell me how to feel. They just showed up. They created a space where I could grieve, where I could be angry, and where I could slowly begin to figure out who I was without the constant, crushing weight of my family's expectations. And in that space, I started to realize that my grandparents had given me more than a fortune. They had given me a future I could build on my own terms, surrounded by people who valued me for who I was, not for what I could give them. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in my life, I wasn't walking it alone. 6 months have passed since that day. 6 months of learning, of grieving, and of rebuilding. The legal battle ended before it even began. Faced with the mountain of evidence against them and the ironclad nature of the trust, my family had no choice but to withdraw their lawsuit. The jewelry and other items my grandparents owned were quietly returned via a courier service. I moved into my grandparents' house, and slowly, painstakingly, I began to make it my home. The painful emptiness of the first few weeks has gradually been replaced by the warmth of new memories. Sunday dinners have become a tradition again, but now I'm the one hosting. My chosen family, Matthew, Carlos and his family, Rosa, Dorothy, and the others, gather around the old oak table, filling the house with laughter and conversation. I went back to teaching. Much to the surprise of those who assumed I would quit, I returned to my classroom at Sunshine Elementary. The wealth hasn't changed who I am, but it has changed what I can do. I can now fund new books, art supplies, and technology that our school budget could never cover. Every child in my class gets healthy snacks daily and a warm winter coat if they need one. Under Rosa's mentorship, I've begun to learn the ropes of Alexander Logistics. I haven't taken an active management role, but I've made it my mission to ensure the company continues to operate on my grandparents' values, including their profit-sharing program for employees and generous retirement benefits. And with the guidance of Matthew and my grandparents' financial advisors, I established the Elizabeth and Harold Alexander Foundation for Education, dedicating $10 million to supporting underprivileged students and underfunded schools in our community. As for my biological family, the consequences of their actions were swift and severe. The details from the evidence folders, though never officially made public, somehow found their way into the right circles. My father's reputation was shattered, and his business suffered. I heard through the grapevine that he and my mother are now living separately. Their marriage, once held together by social ambition and, as I now know, obligation, couldn't survive the public humiliation and financial strain. Jason was hit the hardest. Cut off from his lifelong financial supply, he was forced to get a real job for the first time in his life. About a month ago, A call came through from an unknown number. It was him. His voice was different, quieter, tired. He didn't ask for money. He didn't make excuses. He just apologized for everything. He said he was sorry for how he had treated me, sorry for taking everything for granted, and sorry for his part in that horrible night. It was the first genuine, heartfelt thing I had ever heard him say. I accepted his apology. I told him I was glad he called. But I also made the new boundaries clear. Our relationship could not go back to what it was. If he wanted to talk, he could call. But money would never be a part of our conversations again. He understood. It was a start. A small, tentative step toward a different kind of future. Last week, on a crisp autumn morning much like the day of their accident, I visited my grandparents' graves for the first time since the funeral. I sat on the small bench nearby and just talked to them. I told them about the foundation, about the first 3 students who had already received full college scholarships. I told them their employees still spoke of them with such love and respect. I think I finally understand, I whispered, a gentle breeze rustling the leaves around me. The inheritance was never about the money. It was a test. It was a tool. It was a responsibility. You were entrusting me with your legacy, a legacy of using resources for something meaningful, not for status or power. I've learned so much in these past 6 months. I've learned that your value isn't determined by your family, but by your character. I've learned that financial independence is freedom, but true freedom is realizing you don't need anyone's approval to live your own life. And most importantly, I've learned that family isn't about blood. It's about who shows up. It's about who stands with you, who respects you, and who loves you for exactly who you are. The money revealed my biological family's true colors, but it also revealed a community of genuine connection that I never knew I had. And that was the real inheritance, more valuable than any dollar amount. My journey has been a painful one, but it brought me here, to a life of purpose, surrounded by a family of my own choosing. And for that, I am profoundly grateful. What about you? Have you ever had to set difficult boundaries with the people you love? I'd love to hear how you navigated those painful but necessary conversations. Share your experience in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about finding your strength. Thank you for listening.